Okay, guys, let's start. I'll be waiting for you to make comments, okay? And well, since the recording will be available, I can answer afterwards. That's okay. I can actually record a video for those who didn't have the chance to be live with me today. But I'd like to start by saying it's a privilege to be here. I would like to thank my good friend Claire Venables for inviting me. And I will be talking today about the neuroscience of language acquisition, myths, facts, and cognitive benefits. It is okay. Claire is there. Hello, Claire. Mr. Trunk says hi. Thank you for inviting us. Yeah, perfect. So, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. That's a great opportunity for me to talk about some of the concepts I've been learning or studying, at least. I'm not sure if I've learned them yet when I joined this new MBE SIG, which stands for Mind, Brain, and Education. So this talk here is basically the same thing I did about 3 weeks ago when we launched our SIG. I don't know if anybody was there, so it would have been great to actually meet some of you. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have another event, so you're all invited. So let's start. The neuroscience of language acquisition. If you want to refer to this talk later, or if you want to talk to me or get to know more about the concepts I'm going to discuss here, please follow me on social media, send me an email, and if you share anything, try to use one of the hashtags here, because I really like to keep track of what people are saying and their response to the talks that I'm giving all over Brazil. All right, so we have 6 sections. We're going to talk about some of the myths and then the critical period hypothesis. I'm going to contrast that with other myths. We're going to talk about the other people who actually do not defend this idea of critical period hypothesis. What about technology? What does technology say about that? And what are the cognitive benefits of being bilingual or multilingual? What can we conclude from all of those concepts? So which myths do you know? I'm not sure if you can see very well, but I'm going to show you some sentences here. And I'm going to read each one of them. I want you to keep them in mind so that throughout this conversation we're having, we try to debunk some of the myths here. So it's a funny way that we use now in neuroscience and MBE, neurofact or neuromyth. So the facts are those concepts that have evidence to support them in the scientific literature. And the myths are those that, despite the technology and all the studies, people are still propagating, and they can be very harmful to learning. So I'm going to read all of them, keep them in mind, and try, as we're talking, try to figure out which ones are myths and which ones are facts, okay? And somebody once asked me, are the ones in bold the myths and the other ones in the facts? Not really. I just put them in bold to contrast a little, I guess. Anyway, bilingual people are better decision makers. Kids should not learn many languages at the same time. Children are better language learners than adults. Bilingual brains have an internal fight to switch languages. Lack of accent seems to be the only benefit early birds have. After 50 years old, adults don't benefit cognitively from language learning. After 13 years old, the ability to learn a language declines, and finally, degenerative brain diseases can be delayed in bilingual brains, okay? I'm gonna give you 10 seconds. Well, I know it's not enough, but just try to think which ones are myths now. I'm gonna give you 30 seconds. Okay, not an easy task, but we're going to talk about them. So let's start with this Albert Einstein's quotes. I like it very much, and I think It sort of explains why we don't know everything yet. So only two things are infinite: the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the former. I'm not sure if you know, but Albert Einstein died in the 50s, and he was probably, he's referred to even today as one of the most brilliant men that ever lived on the planet. And he was a great physicist. And he did, in fact, make a huge contribution to science and especially to his field. But one thing he didn't know, even though he was brilliant, is that the universe is finite, according to the latest research we have. So the universe is in expansion. So I use this quote to call your attention to something. We don't know everything yet, and we will never know. Science is making progress, and we're trying to get there. So what we do know today is very little, especially about the brain. The brain is a very complex organ, so we do know a couple of things. They're not absolute truths, but we're still trying to get more information about the brain. So remember, if Albert Einstein didn't know that, imagine us, right? He was a brilliant guy. Now, what about critical period? What is critical period? I'd like to take a look at the words that form this term, critical and period, individually, so that we can have a better idea of what it means. The first word is critical. Critical means having a decisive or crucial importance in the success, failure, or existence of something. And I'm going to give you a little more context for us to analyze. So, the avoidance of injury is critical to a professional athlete, which means that if the athlete gets injured, the athlete will probably have to stop playing, or maybe they will have to give up their career. It's critical, it's essential, fundamental. Now, it is critical that we keep the content of the letters secret. If somebody finds out what's written there, maybe a revolution will start, or somebody's going to be murdered, or I don't know, something very, very bad will happen. So critical, fundamental again, essential, paramount. Now, continued funding is critical for the project, meaning that if we do not have any more funding, we are not going to get the project going. So we're going to have to stop, to abort this project, right? Critical again, fundamental, paramount. Now, let's take a look at the other word, period. Period is a fixed time during the life of a person or in history. So pay attention, I'll go back just a little here. Fixed time, that's very important for our talk here. Fixed time, there's a start, there's an end. After that, no more. Let's take a look at period in context. Most teenagers go through a rebellious period. So it's a phase in their lives, right? Her time at university was the happiest period of her life. And he was one of the most important writers of that period. That means that after that period, after that phase, after that time, there was somebody very important, but not from the same period. So period, fixed time in history, in a person's life, right? So if we think about critical period is an essential, a fundamental, a paramount, fixed period, or better, fixed time in which something needs to happen, right? That means that after this critical period, something shouldn't happen or will not happen as efficiently, or will be almost virtually impossible to happen. Okay, now let's take a look at the timeline. So I'm pretty sure you are familiar with the father of modern linguistics, Noam Chomsky, who is working with political science nowadays. I actually did the other way around. You know, I started with international relations, political science, and now I'm working with linguistics. And Chomsky is definitely one of the most brilliant linguists we've ever had. So he was the one who proposed that there is something in common. There are a lot of languages in the world, but they must have something in common that children are able to pick up. and because they have some sort of mechanism in their heads that will recognize and pick up those sounds and make sense out of those sounds. So that's the language acquisition device. For them to be effective, for this device to be effective, there has to be something in common with all the languages that we have. And in fact, I think most of us agree that Chomsky was right there. But Chomsky was one of the people, one of the authors who supported somehow that there is a critical period, that after this period, learning or acquiring a language doesn't really happen, right? And here I'm going to use learning and acquiring. I'm going to interchange learning and acquiring, but to make myself clear, acquiring is subconscious. It is something it's not a conscious process. It's just by being surrounded by people who are using that language that you are going to grasp that, you're going to get this language. Now, learning is a conscious process, so you have to be somehow forced or by yourself, you have to be motivated to do that. You do have an option when you, well, if we're talking about kids, not really, but still, learning needs you to be a volunteer, let's say. Now, take a look at the timeline. So all those authors here, dating back to the 1950s, they have discussed the critical period hypothesis. So in the 1950s, in 1959 to be more specific, Penfield and Roberts, they started studying brains, so people who had some kind of lesion in their brains, and they were extremely important in terms of mapping the anatomy of the brain, so finding the places, the functions of the brain. However, today, as part of the MBE group, we know that functions are not so localized like that, that other parts of the brain can take over if there's some kind of problem. But we do know that most people have, here in the left hemisphere, the temporal lobe, they have the control center, let's say, for language. So Penfield realized that by probing, by sticking something to different parts of the brain, and he realized that this part of the brain developed until 13 years old, approximately, when puberty starts. So he came up with this theory that there is a critical period for first language acquisition. That's what he was discussing. And this period goes from 2 years of age until 13, give or take, but basically that. So that was Penfield, right? He didn't really use this word critical, this term, the terminology critical period. That was popularized by Lenneberg. We're going to talk about him in a while. But a very important study in the 1960s by Hubel and Wiese really influenced not only Chomsky and everybody else, and of course, a lot of people who were influenced by Hubel and Wiese, they transferred whatever findings they were able to get to language acquisition. But the study that they did was with cats. So they, and I have 2 cats here, by the way. So if they start meowing or shouting or, you know, actually crying, not shouting, right? No language there. But if they start crying, don't worry, they're okay. They're just looking for attention. So they blindfolded those cats for a couple of weeks after they were born. And so they were unable to receive any stimulus, light stimulus from the environment, which means that after they removed the blindfold, for a certain period, they were not able to fully develop their eyesight, their vision, which means that they were partially blind, or they could not recognize horizontal lines, if I'm not mistaken. They could only see vertical lines. And of course, this was transferred to language acquisition. And then in 1967, Lenneberg extended on Penfield's work, and he was the one who popularized the term critical period. So there is a fixed period, remember, fixed period, in which stimuli are essential for us to develop a certain capability. And then we have Krashen, who extended on Chomsky work, and if we look at all those authors, I'm pretty sure you're very familiar with Krashen. they all defend to a certain extent that the critical period is something that we have to take into account when we're talking about language acquisition. Only Krashen and Chomsky, in a certain way, are actually linked to the realm, let's say, of second language acquisition, if you think about it, as pioneers, because then we have Johnson and Newport, who worked with birdsong. I'm going to talk about him in a while. So most people here, they were doing the pioneers, they were doing work on different functions. So it was not language, and that's one of the key problems here. Language is probably, according to Mirella Ramaciotti, our leader, our MBE leader, it is definitely, not probably, the most complex of human tasks. So transferring the idea of blindfolded cats to second language acquisition is not necessarily it shouldn't be equivalent anyway. And then some other authors discuss that instead of a critical period, there might be something that should be called the sensitive period. So I will give you 30 seconds to look at here the heading. So starts and ends, during the period, after the period, and examples. Try to think. So here we have the sensitive period and the critical period. When does the sensitive period start and end, as opposed to the critical period? Try to imagine. Okay, that was a hard question, but it depends on the critical period. So something I forgot to mention, there are different critical periods for different capabilities, for different functions. And since we're talking about language is not just one thing, right? So we can talk about morphology and semantics and phonology, and so there is a critical period for phonology, for sounds, and there is a critical period for morphology, for words and meanings, and so it is different. So there's not just one critical period, but the whole idea is a sensitive period starts and ends gradually. It's not fixed. So we go back to the fixed period essential. The critical period ends and starts abruptly. So it is really fixed. So it kind of gives me the idea that, okay, my son, my daughter, they're probably 12 now. We have 1 year before their critical period, loses its validation. So we have to enroll them right now. It doesn't really happen like that, right? But yeah, if they start sooner, they will be more exposed to the language for the longer period, for a longer term anyway. Now, during the period, it is a period of maximal sensitivity, maximal, and here heightened sensitivity to external stimuli that are compulsory for the development of a particular skill. So maximal and heightened sensitivity. After the period, the skill can still be learned, but less efficiently. So the window never closes, actually, according to the sensitive period hypothesis. It never closes. The cortical areas allocated for the particular skill will adapt and perform a different function. Now, which means that after you close the window, the window closes here. Whatever, the cells will be allocated to do something else, like the cats. They will not be able to fully develop their vision. But does it work with languages? So the 2 examples I got here, and Montessori did a extensive work on that, the developmental stages of kids. So if you think about language falls into this category of sensitive period. And visual capabilities would be an example for critical periods. Anyway, okay, I can see some more people are getting here. Hello. I hope I'm not going too fast. If you want to ask questions, please just write comments there, and if I have the chance, I'll stop and answer your questions, or I can just record a video or maybe write something about it on my blog so you can follow it, okay? Well, this is Dr. Jack Shunkoff, And this is one of the advocates of the sensitive period hypothesis. And there's a great video. I'm not going to show you the video, but you can look for his name, Dr. Jack Shonkoff, and sensitive period. It's a 3-minute video in which he explains that for language, especially or specifically, there's no such thing as a critical period. If we're talking about second language again, there are differences between first and second language, right? So there is a sensitive period. So even though you didn't have the chance to start as a young kid, a very, very young kid, you can still learn throughout your life. It could be less efficient, though, could be, but we also have a lot of evidence supporting otherwise, that it doesn't really have to be less efficient. As I'm going to show you, Dr. Tracy Takayama Espinosa demonstrates that it's more efficient, actually. And I know a lot of you might disagree. This is not me saying, okay? This is the scientific literature anyway. And then we have this question, and I would like to ask you how you feel about this. So, are kids better language learners than adults? Yes or no? And don't be like my students. It depends, teacher. Just say yes or no. What do you think? All things considered. Okay, no comments. No one wants to expose, right? To get exposed. Okay, I'm going to give you some time. I think the comments will come later. But are kids better language learners than adults? Yes or no? Okay, we got one. I don't know how to pronounce your name, actually. I think yes. Okay, great. And I'm going to ask you again. Do you think most teachers think like you? Do you think most people agree with you that kids are better language learners? Okay, Talita. Okay. That's not what it's showing here. Hello, Talita. Nice to meet you. So what do you think? Most people agree with you or disagree with you? Okay, I think she's writing. Well, people in general think like that. Yes, I would say so. I decided to do my own survey. So how old were you when you started learning English or whatever language that is not your mother tongue? How old were you? So I decided to ask, since I'm connected all over, with Facebook, I decided to ask my friends on Facebook, and that's what I got. Okay. So social media. I asked around, so I'm part of, oh my God, I'm not sure, but a lot of Facebook groups, and I asked everybody, and I just asked a very simple question. When did you start learning or studying English? Before you were 12, between 12 and 18, or after 18? That's what I got. So 510 responses. When did you start studying English? Now, it might be very small, but I can read that to you. So this blue area, before I was 12 years old, the red area is between 12 and 18 years old, and the yellow area after I was 18 years old. Okay, so yes, 61% of the people who responded started before they were 12 years old, just like some people there. I can see Valkyria. Hello, Valkyria, after 18. Thank you very much. Are you a teacher, Valkyria? Do you teach English today? And Talita was 9. Yes. Okay, Valkyria is going to answer. Yes, she's an English teacher. Thank you very much. And then I decided to ask the Brelters. So, when did you start studying English? 51% said before 12, between 18 and between 12 and 18, 41%, after 18, 8%. So if you cross-reference both of those pie charts, you are going to have this: 43.9% of all the people I asked did not learn before they were 12. So I actually I could have asked 13, right? But I decided to ask 12 because, give or take, it's not a fixed time. So that means that they started learning English after the so-called critical period, right? And I'm assuming here that because they are teachers, I would not be able to know their level of proficiency anyway, but if they're teachers, they might be very fluent, very proficient anyway. This is a high number, if you think about it. If there is a critical period, and after that period is virtually impossible for you to learn. So, this should be much lower, right? If we think about it in those terms. And if you see me looking around, my cats are running all over the apartment now. Thank God nobody blindfolded them when they were little kittens, right? Anyway, so my question is, critical period? Is it critical period? So 2 observations here. First of all, yes, there is something called critical period. It was transferred from animal models to humans, and it basically talks about visual capabilities, and we know there are other capabilities that would fall into this category, of course, but there are different critical periods, and there's a lot of evidence in the latest research nowadays showing that for language, for second language, above everything, above all, for second language, there is no such thing as critical period. Now, there are some examples in the literature, and I don't know if you were exposed to them, but there is Jeannie Wiley. I'm not sure that's her last name, but she was a wild child who was found in the United States. She was abused by her father for 12 years. She never communicated with anybody. She was basically trapped, locked in her bedroom. And 2 linguists of the United States at the time, I think Curtis and I'm not sure from Kim, I don't remember the last name. So they studied her and they wrote books about her. It was at the time, 1970s, that the critical period hypothesis was being discussed, and they tested if she was going to be able to learn her first language, which was English. And she did learn, but it was not perfect. She never fully developed, so she had a lot of impairments in terms of cognition. But then again, was it because of lack of exposure until she was 12, 13, or is it because she was severely abused by her father and she had some kind of block of some kind of cognition deficit that didn't allow her to, anyway, learn a language? Again, it's very hard for you to test that. Empirically speaking, how are you going to isolate a kid for 12, 13 years to actually test if after that they can pick up a language, their first language? So, and there was the famous boy of Aveyron in France in the late 1700s. He was found by a hunter in the woods, and he was adopted by one of the most prominent physicians, linguists at the time, Itard, and he tried to teach him French, and he developed the language, but with a lot of impairments again. So there are some classic cases that we can look at for us to to have an idea of how this works. Now, let's go to the second quote. Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." So again, science is about having a conversation with other people who are testing the same things you are, and not just that, other people who are doing different things, right? So we got the authors who defend the critical period hypothesis, right? And then we have some people who are against, who refute that. So this is Benny, the Irish polyglot. I don't know if you've ever watched this video, just look for it on YouTube, Benny the Irish polyglot, and he speaks 8 languages in this video. So I found out about this guy. This guy has, I don't like the way he advertises his books and courses. He says fluent in 3 months, but he explains why he uses that. It's just a challenge that he's offering anyway. And then I watched his TED talk, and he says here, is it really age at play, or is it the way that kids learn that makes a difference? And then he mentioned there was actually a study at the University of Haifa in Israel that this expert tested 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and 12-year-olds and adults, and but young adults, 20-something-year-old adults, and he realized that the adults performed better. Every aspect they tested for, semantics, morphology, phonology, everything, the adults performed better. So the University of Haifa in Israel, right? That's the university, that's the paper. So I started doing some digging. No childhood advantage in the acquisition of skill in using an artificial language rule. Artificial language rule, Dr. Avi Karni created a language based on Hebrew so that he would be able to control the environment, and subjects could not access this language outside the laboratory, or not the laboratory, the classroom, right? And you know what? I went to Israel and I met this guy, and I actually interviewed this guy, Dr. Avi Karni. And then he told me that, and this is what, basically that's the conclusion of his paper. He told me that in line with recent reports of no childhood advantage in non-linguistic skill learning, we propose that under some learning conditions, adults can effectively express their language skill acquisition potential. Altogether, the maturational effects in the acquisition of an implicit this is artificial morphological rule or artificial language, do not support simple notion of a language skill learning advantage in children. So it's not really about that, about age, it's about exposure. And then I started thinking, after I talked to Dr. Avi Karni, I started thinking about the courses that, the schools that I worked for. So I worked at Cultura Inglesa in São Paulo, and now I work at a binational center here in Goiânia. And then I started comparing how long does it take kids to get to the level in which they would be proficient, or they would be apt or able to take a proficiency test or a competency test or a fluency test, Cambridge test, for example. So how long does it take a kid, informal studying, formal training, from the day they start, from the basic level, till they get to the level in which they can do the FCE test, for example, the first certificate. That's an upper intermediate test, right? How long does it take? And then how long does it take the adult to get to the same place, right? And who gets there first? That's the big question. Who's going to get there first? How many years does the kid have to study to be able to get to the FCE and the CAE and the CPE? And how many years does the adult have to study to get to the same levels, right? And in every teaching setting that I've had the pleasure to work, basically kids, they take longer, right? But that means they're exposed for a longer time. And that also means that they don't have the cognitive skills necessary for them to be able to pass the test, right? Because you wouldn't ask a 11-year-old to do a CPE, because how would they even be able to discuss what is proposed there? But still, it is a very good reference if you think about it. Let's use the tests, the international certificates to evaluate how long does it take, right? So if the kid and the adult start at the same time, I'm pretty sure the adult will get there faster. Is it because the adult has some kind of advantage, or because the cognitive functions, the executive functions here in the prefrontal cortex are more developed than the kids? And then we can discuss that, right? Now, if you take a look at the other timeline, who are the others? Escher and Price, so dating back to the 1960s. Snow, Hefnagel, and Hurle in the 1970s, and Valberg, Haas, and Rascher, 70s too. Walsh and Diller. Bongertz did a very interesting study with Dutch and Furman and Carney, Dr. Avi Carney, they all support, they all have evidence supporting that there's no such thing as a critical period hypothesis for second language acquisition. Anyway, now, Dr. Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, she's the princess of MBE now. She's the professor. She was a professor of Mirella Ramaciotti, our leader, and she does something very interesting. She has a 1 hour or 1 hour and a half video about the myths and facts of multilingualism. So you really have to watch this video. And then she starts by, similar to what I've done, I actually copied that from her, showing some myths and some facts. And then she says, it is impossible for an adult to learn a new language without an accent, right? So this seems to be the only disadvantage that adults have in terms of learning a language. So the thing is, if you start early, especially if you are a very young kid, you are going to be better able to discriminate between sounds, right? And there's a wonderful TED Talk by Patricia Cole, and she tested 6-month-old kids. And she realized that there is a gap between the 6th and the 7th month in which kids are better able to distinguish between Mandarin, for example, and English sounds. After this gap, after 2 or 3 months, actually after the 12th month, sometimes, kids, they cannot distinguish those sounds if they were not exposed to those sounds, right? But then again, is having an accent such a big deal, such a big problem? I look at accents as, basically as fonts, right? Different fonts, different colors, different sizes. Even though they're different, we can pretty much understand what they're saying, right? And maybe I don't like this one or this one, but still I can understand what it says. I know there are some situations in which accents can be an impediment to communication, but still having an accent can be sexy, or can be some kind of cultural, you can keep your cultural identity. So, is it really a disadvantage? And then again, critical period. Now, what does critical emphasize? Critical emphasizes essential, fundamental, paramount. What does period emphasize? Period emphasizes a fixed time. After this time, no more. Critical versus sensitive. Critical is, it starts and ends abruptly, and sensitive gradually, so you can still learn, but it might be less efficient. But according to Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, according to Avi Carney, it's not less efficient. Adults are better language learners than kids given the proper conditions. And I'm going to show which conditions are those. And Dr. Avi Carney found out basically that kids, they are not as good learners as adults in the environments that he created, right? Oh yes, somebody said, Talita. Yes, to have a bad accent, exactly, right? But again, if you think about it, there are people from the western part of the USA and the eastern part of the USA, in England and northern England and southern England, and we have people from New Zealand and from Australia, and we can pretty much understand what they say. But if there are some cases, of course, the countryside or the Far East, that people have a very thick accent, and it is hard for communication, sure. But still, overall, we can understand most people, right? There are some exceptions. And then the question is, are there more accents that are hard to understand, or more accents that we can understand, right? So having an accent is not necessarily a disadvantage. If you are from, I don't know, if you're from India, it might be very hard to understand what you're saying, but if you are from another country, it might not be very hard to understand what you're saying. So it depends very much on other factors. So what I'm trying to say is, having an accent is not a variable that really interferes with your communication. It depends on which accent you have, right? So it's more about what accent than having an accent, right? And then Steve Jobs once said, computers themselves and software yet to be developed will revolutionize the way we learn. And then, indeed, he was right. Steve Jobs was really right when he said that. And I think that it takes technology for us to be able to test a couple of things, right? So let's take a look at what technology has to say. So we do have a very sophisticated machine that started being used a couple of decades ago. It's called the functional MRI, right? So it's the magnetic resonance imaging machine, right? And they produce very interesting images like those. We can actually see inside people's brains and take pictures and map the activity. So the areas that light up and the areas that don't light up. And then Edna Andrews, who's a professor at Duke, actually she's nowadays she's one of the directors there. She gave a very interesting interview about the neuroscience of language learning, why most humans are bilingual. So most humans are bilingual. And she said this: as a result, we were able to analyze the degree to which fMRI can track language acquisition and derive empirically valid information about the achievements of the subjects in a range of measurements. In terms of understanding the relationship of brain and language, our results fit in with the important findings that proficiency is a more important factor than age of acquisition. And with higher proficiency, there are more similarities in the mappings of one's first and second or third languages. So the big factor that influences if you are going to be a successful learner of a second language is how far you go. So it's not when you started, but how far do you go? So if you started when you were 7 and you go till you are 14 or 16 or 17, you've studied for 10 years. And if you were able to, make progress and get to the last level and do your tests and pass, that means you have a certain level of proficiency. Now, do adults do the same thing? Do they get to the final, to the end of the course, to the last level of their course? I remember that when I was working at Cultura Inglesa, for example, we had to call the students to check if they were going to come back to have an idea. And the return rates or the re-enrollment rates of the last levels, the CAE and the CPE levels were the lowest, and a lot of dropouts along the way. I remember we used to work with maybe almost 5,000 students, so the rates were very low anyway. So do adults get to the last stage of their course? So is it really about when they started or how far they go, right? So we have to have that in mind as well. And we have more evidence. Abu Talebi from the San Raffaele Institute in Italy concluded that the evidence reviewed in this paper, and he took a lot of papers from 2008, a lot of papers that preceded him, a lot of imaging evidence. So he reviewed in this paper supports a dynamic view of the neural basis of L2 processing. First, concerning language acquisition, L2 seems to be acquired through the same neural structures responsible for L1 acquisition. This appears to be the case for the acquisition of grammar in late L2 learners, contrary to what one may expect because of the notion of critical periods. So what he's saying basically is that the same neural pathway, the same neural process or network or structures are responsible for the acquisition of L1 and L2. If the same neural structures are at play there, so they should be acquired in a very similar way. We have to not regard age as something critical. The thing is, if you do start at a younger age, you will probably stay longer. You will be exposed longer to the language, and you have better chances of being successful. But it's not really because of your age, but just because you had more time to be with the language, right? And then Dr. Avi Carney also says that several neuroimaging studies also suggest that the identification of different brain activation foci for early and late second language acquisition may reflect factors such as the amount and duration of experience or the nature of the language experience rather than childhood window of opportunity. Again, this is the latest research. There are other authors that still defend that there is a critical period for second language acquisition. So this is not what I think. This is what science is telling us, right? And again, remember what Einstein said. We're still making progress. We cannot take anything as absolute truth, truth. But we should probably look at the evidence and try to make sense of it, right? Christophe Pallier at the Institut National de la Santé et Recherche Médicale, I think. So that's a medical research and health institute in France. He did a very interesting study. So he got all the brain imaging studies at the time. So this is a little more recent. And the early imaging studies, they show that if you are an early bilingual, you're going to have both languages, native 1, native 2, in the same area. So this is the temporal lobe, right? In the same area. But if you're a late bilingual, you're going to separate the processes, right? And then, so which means that there is some kind of advantage if you start early. Here, not really. Then he took a look at some more, even a little more recent, after the first, those were done in the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, he showed that a lot of different areas light up when the students or the patients, the subjects, use L1 or L2, which means that they have completely different processes, right? But most studies, and there are even more recent studies, they show that the same areas light up when you're using the two languages. And so there's more evidence here than there before. So that shows, again, corroborating what Abutalebi says, that the same areas are involved when we're using L2 or L1 or L2. And then how important are MRI scans? We can see the areas that light up inside the brain, and we can have an idea that, okay, if L1 happens here, L2 happens here too. What's more important than age? Proficiency, exposure, long-term exposure. What does Abutalebi say about the neural bases? The neural structure is the same for L1 and L2 processing. What So what did Pallier conclude? Pallier concluded that there are more studies with evidence supporting that L1 and L2 are processed in the same areas, which means that they can get very close in terms of proficiency, right? I do apologize for the sertanejo music because I'm in Goiânia and there are some people, and I'm on the 11th floor, but we can still hear because there's some crazy guy with his car. Anyway, I'm not a big fan of sertanejo. I hope you guys are. And to finish, intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, right? So let's talk about the cognitive benefits of being bilingual. I realize it's very small. I'm just going to read. So being bilingual makes a person smarter and has a profound effect on brain, improving cognitive skills. Bilingual children as young as 7 months can easily adjust to environmental changes. Seniors who are bilingual can experience less cognitive decline. And we don't have to read everything, but prevents dementia. It's better for switching between tasks. Denser gray matter that is responsible for processing language, memory, focusing better on tasks. So you have an advantage. Okay, I think Talita wrote something. Maybe we have the impression about kids' language acquisition because they are free during a long period of their childhood to learn a second language without the pressure of they have to, exactly. And on the other hand, adults have less time or will, even energy to dedicate themselves to go till the end. Does it make sense? Yes, exactly. So because kids start early, they have more time to be with the language, to be exposed to the language. And so they have better chances of success. But still, if adults apply, so what are the conditions? We are the perfect examples of the conditions. We are teachers. We are using the language all the time. we are more proficient than kids, and we can get there faster, even if we started after 18, right? So we have experienced the conditions. It's exposure, it's experience, it's not giving up, it's going till the end, right? So those are the conditions. Improved memory, improved decision-making skills, more awareness of language, high scores in everything, basically, good in solving math. So bilingualism is awesome, you know? Develop strong thinking skills, mental health, academic performance, preparation for the future. You can actually delay Alzheimer's disease. And Valkyrie started when she was 27. Take a look. And I'm pretty sure she's a successful learner of the language. So you can delay dementia and Alzheimer's disease by 5 years just because you're bilingual, you know? It's pretty awesome. What about neurodegenerative diseases? You can delay them just by being bilingual. Why better academic performance? Because if you are bilingual, you're going to have improved memory, better executive functions, which are responsible for organizing, planning, prioritizing tasks. So, and of course, you're going to be better at logics, so math. So that's why you're going to have better academic performance. What about making decisions? Again, executive function, prefrontal cortex. You're going to you are always switching between languages if you're bilingual. So you are making decisions every second, like I am now. I'm choosing. It's not really conscious, but I'm choosing to use the lexicon, the vocabulary that I have in English rather than Portuguese. Even though I know how to speak Portuguese, it's my native language, right? How is it related to math? Well, again, logical thinking, making decisions. So it involves a lot of processes that will benefit the kid who's taking math. Conclusions. So I have 2 minutes to conclude. Conclusions. Critical period is just the tip of the iceberg, especially if we're talking about second language acquisition. So there are people who have started after they were 30, 40, 50, and they were successful learners. It's really, it depends on how far they will go rather than when they started. So there is something better to describe a period in which you can learn a second language. That's the sensitive period. So again, there's no transfer. You cannot just transfer what Huber and Wiesel did with the cats, with the eyes, with the eyesight, to language acquisition. They are very different processes anyway. And experience, it is about experience, about being around, about having an emotional connection of, of course you're always going to have an emotional connection, but some adults, they're going to be more inhibited, more, they're not going to be very comfortable exposing themselves in the classroom. So this will affect, because we have to use the language, use it or lose it, right? We have to use it so that we can become fluent speakers of the language. So there has to be with experience too. It has to be with experience. Proficiency is more important than age. It is more about how far you go again than at what age you started. Exposure, that's it. Kids, they will be exposed for a very long, so we're not talking about punctual exposure, but long-term exposure. So kids are probably going to be exposed to this language, especially nowadays. If you think about it, kids are exposed to English all over the place with Facebook and WhatsApp, Instagram, and all the social media we have around, right? And there is a wonderful video. You can look at this. What is the best age to learn a second language? Discovery Channel. It's about 4 minutes, and then they explain that, yeah, kids, they are at the exuberant period. They're making millions of synapses, every minute, and they consume a lot of energy. Their brain consumes a lot of energy, and we consume. They tested how much glucose is necessary just for the brain to keep functioning, and kids like 4 times more, or at least 3 times more than us. So they are really working with their brains, but still Is it really about the age, or is it more about the longevity, let's say, or exposure, long-term exposure, okay? And finally, to debunk the myths, we have bilingual people are better decision makers. Yes, they are, because executive functions, we have to decide which language to use. Kids should not learn many languages at the same time. That's totally a myth. They can learn as many languages as possible, you know? That's good for them. Children are better language learners than adults. Well, sorry, but myth. That's what Tracy Tokuhama at Harvard says, yeah. We can be better. We are not in the right conditions many times, and we do not go through, you know, we just don't follow through. We don't go to the end of the course, okay? And then bilingual brains have an internal fight to switch languages, yes. Lack of accent seems to be the only benefit early birds have. Yes, that is true. That's a fact. After 50 years old, adults don't benefit cognitively from language learning. That's a myth. You can start learning a language at any age, basically. And we were in a talk about the amount of synapses that child to 12 have, so that's the best period, yes. Well, that's the best, but that's, again, having a lot of synapses, but not being able to process very complex language. So there should be a balance there, right? Even though you have a lot of synapses, can you talk about, I don't know, making, can you discuss decisions and collaboration with a partner, and adults can do that. So even though I have a lot of, let's say, energy, it doesn't mean I'm going to be the best runner, you know, or if so it's not because I am better equipped somehow that I'm going to be the most successful at whatever I'm doing, but it is about the conditions, right? If you think about it, kids 2 to 12, what are the topics that we normally say, right? So actually what he's saying, that's a myth, and it makes total sense to me, right? So what are the topics that we normally teach kids between 2 and 12? And what are the topics that we have in adults' books? So the level of usage, let's say, of the language is more sophisticated for adults, right? So yes, kids, they have a burst of synapses all over the place. And so that's the exuberant period. So that's the sensitive, right? So, but the exposure is what makes the former kid when becomes an adult. Yes, exposure, exactly. But if the adult is exposed for a long time and follows through to the end of their course without any, let's say, stopping and coming back and, giving up, dropping out and coming back, they will be as successful and sometimes even more successful than kids, right? Kids, they don't really have an option of dropping out the course. If you think about it, they will go through, they will follow through because their parents tell them to, right? And it is about being exposed to. So if you are a kid and you are learning a second language, like our students, you can't really say, listen, mom, I think this is not going to work for me and I'm going to give up. But adults, they do that all the time. So the retention rates of re-enrollment rates that I told you before, they were lower for adults because they don't have time. There is a window of opportunity when we think about memory consolidation. So kids, they have an easier life than we do, right? So when an adult finishes the class, they have to deal with a lot of information at work, personal, academic lives, and everything they are doing after this lesson is going to interfere with their learning. So it is harder for them. If you think about it, it is harder for adults to be successful, but they are somehow. They can keep the same level of kids if they follow through, if they go, if they can go all the way till the end of their course. So they can be as proficient as or more. They can take a CPE exam. There are a lot of successful teachers who started, as I told you before, after they were 18 or after they were 12, after the critical period hypothesis. So the point I'm trying to make here is we should not say critical, we should say sensitive. It is easier for kids to learn but it doesn't mean that they are going to be more successful than adults. So if we could keep the same conditions for both kids and adults, right, who would be better? So there are a lot of experiments that I showed, especially the one from Israel, Dr. Avi Karni, showing that adults performed better than kids when you kept the same conditions. So time to study, exposure. What I'm trying to say here is, and just to finish, after 13 years old, the ability to learn a language declines. Not necessarily. So this is a partial myth. Not necessarily. It could, because not because of your brain, not because of your neuroplasticity necessarily, because you still have a lot. You have less, but you have a lot. But because of your social conditions, okay? And that degenerative brain diseases can be delayed in bilingual brains, most certainly, yes, by 5 years. So the thing is, I hope this analogy helps you understand what I'm trying to say here, according to the studies that I've been doing. It's not that adults are not going to be successful. So learning English, the goal of learning English is almost like getting a train to go somewhere, right? If you miss the early train, you have a lot of other options. You don't have to get the first train to get there. It's a journey, but you can get the second, the last train. You're still going to get there. It's going to be, maybe it's going to take longer because there's more traffic on the railroad, but still you can get there, right? So if you think about it as the destination where you want to get, the final destination, the problem is sometimes adults, they get off the train before they get to their final destination. Kids, they don't really have a lot of option there, right? And this is Mr. João. This is my student who started studying with me 4 years ago. And before that, he had never really had formal instruction or formal training in English. So he started studying English after he was 37, 38, almost 40, by himself, learning through books. He never really talked to anyone. Today, he's an upper intermediate level after he studied with me for 4 years, basically. So, and of course, my cat is always trying to learn something from us here. So Mr. João is one example that everybody can learn. At any age, people can learn. It might be, if it's not about difficulties, about dedication, following through. And if we know that, and if we look at the evidence, and we tell our students that, if we tell our students, our adult students, that they can learn, that they are able to learn, they will, maybe we can solve a big problem we have in Brazil, dropping out rates, If you think about it, a lot of students come when they're older and they say, oh, I will never learn because I should have started when I was a kid. But then you can say, listen, there's a lot of evidence out there pointing to the fact that, no, you can be a better learner than a kid. It's all about how much time you put into doing that and how far you go, right? Yeah, Gisele, I'm not saying it's impossible, but harder. I learned English myself at 19 and never been to an English course until I got to London at 21, exactly, right? I started learning German when I was 20, I must have been 22, I think, and I studied for a couple of years, and today I'm fluent in German. I'm losing because I have to practice, use it or lose it, right? And I agree with you, but then again, is it because of your brain capabilities or because of your life conditions, right? If you think about it. And according to the evidence that I showed today, it's more about your life conditions, because you have to study other things, you have to worry about work, you have to pay your bills, you have to do whatever. So kids, they have the advantage of time more than, because the advantage of neuroplasticity and synapses plays a big role, sure, yes, especially for first language acquisition, right? And but still, it doesn't really play a big role if you think about the learning itself, the learning of the language itself, because they will be successful as adults will be successful. But kids, they have a cognitive, I would say, let's say, delay in terms of prior knowledge, because we have more prior knowledge. So our declarative memory, the memory of people, objects, words, is more developed, or at least more used than the kids' declarative memory. They use more procedural memory. So the how to speak, okay, they are better, but the what to speak, we might be better. With the, the words, the lexicon, the vocabulary we have is more sophisticated than that of kids anyway. So that's it. Thank you very much. I think I passed 10 minutes of my time. And again, ask me more questions. I'd be glad to answer them. And I'm not claiming here that whatever I showed you is the absolute truth. There are authors on both sides. Some people defend that there is a critical period for second language acquisition. And yes, I've never thought at this point of view exactly. So yes, me neither until very recently. So and then I read the articles, I watched the videos. So there is a lot of evidence supporting that there is no such thing as critical period for second language learning or acquisition. We can start at any age, and we can be successful if we're taught and if we're learning under the right conditions. And if you have that in mind, and if you tell your students that, especially the old ones, the adults, maybe they will be successful learners. Sometimes they don't even start because they have that myth or this idea that they can do it, but they can. And it's being demonstrated by a lot of scientists out there. So I hope you liked it. Bye. And Mr. Trunk says bye. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, everyone watching. That's it. Bye-bye. And write your questions here. I'll be glad to answer them later. Okay. Bye.